Welcome to Modern Medieval, the podcast. I'm Megan.
And I'm Elo. And today we're going to speak about laughing at or with the Middle Ages. This episode is going to be quite different from what you heard before. We're trying something new. We're discussing things that we've learned about and thought about quite a lot. So I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, definitely a change of pace from last week as well. Trying to lighten the mood rather than bring us down. But we'll see how they're all related. And again, how the medieval is involved in it all. First,
we're going to tell you about some of the news this week that reminded us of the medieval and the Middle Ages and perhaps some of the things that we talked about last week.
The day that we submitted and released our last podcast for you all, we got a headline that the bubonic plague has been diagnosed in at least 2 people in China. Now, I can't recall if we mentioned this last week, but the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, has never actually completely disappeared. It has been around. People are diagnosed every year. It's a handful, but it's still around. So it's quite interesting to think about the fact that this made international headlines.
Yeah.
And its relationship, once again, maybe it's this pandemic time and thinking, oh no, the bubonic plague, the Black Death is coming.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well. I don't know if you're in your circle, this is a topic of conversation, but like in my close family and friends and all that, there's been like talk of like, okay, well, this one will end, and then there's millions of possibilities of other contagious diseases that might spread.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard about the one that has been going through. It's one of the countries that is that used to be part of the USSR that butts up against China. I think it's like it's not Kazakhstan, but it's one of those countries. I'm gonna have to double check.
Turkmenistan?
Maybe it's Turkmenistan. That has killed at least 1,200 people, and it's epidemiologists think that it's
the next one
more violent and contagious than coronavirus. So they're currently trying to maintain that. So that's really lovely. I haven't heard any more about the new swine flu in China, but that was something that we mentioned last week.
Oh, so guys, we promised to lighten the mood after this.
Yeah, but there was another headline. Ella, do you want to?
Yeah. So talking about the reactions to the plague and like literature being a way to escape your reality, we actually found a couple of articles that talked about the Decameron Project, where this was a New York Times article, and the article kind of talked about this project where people would reenact the stories, would adapt them, and how really exemplifying how literature is a means to escape the reality. And it kind of, the way that the fact that the Decameron keeps being brought up kind of shows how people are connecting with the Middle Ages and with the medieval, something that perhaps they would have thought of as an antiquated a couple of months ago. They can now relate to it a bit better, and that's quite interesting as well.
Yeah, and especially this sense of escape through storytelling. And so, that New York Times Magazine article is really, really lovely. We'll add a link to our show notes today, but the way that it takes inspiration from Boccaccio's Decameron, but then it retells it today in contemporary ways. So rather than, I believe it's 10 people over 10 days.
10 people. I think it is 10 people because it's one story a night. That works, yeah.
Right. So with this, the way that it's set up is each day is a contemporary author telling their story or relationship to the current pandemic times.
And actually, if you guys have Netflix, I don't know if you've watched this. I think I may have sent you the link, but not given you any comment on what it is. There's on Netflix. There's this show called Home Project, I think, and in it, a lot of filmmakers, artists, film like a short film of 7 minutes where they show where their imagination has taken them during this time of home-based life.
Yeah, I feel like I do recall you either sending me a link or mentioning, have you watched this? And I said no, and I didn't know what it was.
And then I didn't tell you, so that just kind of ended it.
Yeah, and it kind of leaping off that, just based off of how it sounds. I have found that there's this really fascinating interest. I constantly am seeing, headlines in the news or on Facebook or kind of Twitter threads about how fascinated people are with others' interiors of their homes and like what's on their bookshelves. And it's like an inner glimpse into that inner person. But I feel like this is kind of related to all of that and the way that we tell stories and who tells them and how we tell them and the person themselves and how that kind of helps us. It's a new form of storytelling that helps us get through looking at the same walls, same artworks, same streets every day. So yeah, that project is really, really fascinating and interesting. And then the last thing, it's more recent that has happened that is directly related to the medieval, and we will potentially address in a full-length episode because it's quite fascinating, is the news surrounding the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. And it's reverting back to being a mosque, or the political decision to do that.
Isn't that fascinating? So it was a church, right? Then it became a museum. And then through pressure from the Islamist groups and I think it's the Islamist groups in Turkey, eventually it was decided through a court appeal that it could be reverted to a mosque. Am I correct in the timeline?
Yes, I believe so. So it was built in 537 AD. So it's at the fall of the Roman Empire, but the beginning of the medieval ages. And it was built during the reign of Roman Emperor Justinian I. So it's considered late antique. It's in Istanbul. So for those of you who just need a geographic place to where it is. And it has served as a Greek Orthodox Christian cathedral, a Roman Catholic cathedral, an Ottoman mosque, and then a museum. And I believe the museum was sometime in the mid 20th century. And it's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there is conflict regarding this ruling because in its listing for UNESCO, it is listed as a museum, not as a religiously affiliated current in practice space. And so I don't know the politics or legislation surrounding that, but UNESCO has been like, this is concerning for us.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting because obviously, like, if if a secular building is turned into a religious building, then that kind of changes the whole dynamic, and it changes, the meaning of the monument and of the building and how you consider it and how you relate to it.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of instills a certain type of aura or something regarding that. It also has questions about access. So if it's a mosque,
then you won't be able to go.
Right. Or I know that certain mosques allow tourists, people not of the faith, to tour, but you have to set up appointments. And so when you have this beautiful, beautiful monument that has historically been around for over 1,500 years, how do you take that away from the people? I know that that's not exactly what's happening. No. It's also related to the increasing emergence of religion in Turkey.
Yeah, it's true.
I Googled the type that Hagia Sophia has been historically. So this is according to Wikipedia, but I'll take it at face value. So from 537 to 1054, it was a Byzantine Christian cathedral. From 1054 to 1204, it was a Greek Orthodox cathedral. From 1204 to 1261, it was a Roman Catholic cathedral. From 1261 to 1453, it was a Greek Orthodox cathedral.
Yeah.
From 1453 to 1935, it was an Ottoman mosque. So arguably having either being an Ottoman mosque or some sort of Christian cathedral, it's about a 50-50 split.
Yeah.
And then in 1935, it was created as a museum.
Yeah.
And
It must have been during the reign of Ataturk. I mean, during the time of Ataturk. Maybe reign is not, you know.
Right. It does not say on the side, but I will go yes.
Because he secularized the country, or tried to, or started to.
Yeah,
so
then
it must
that
have been connected.
timeline-wise seems to...
Yeah. So for one of my Capella Palatina essay, I read an article by Stephanie Trigg, who's a very big academic. She's based in Australia, I think, if I remember correctly. Anyway, her article was on how like the experience of visiting cathedrals and like the different types of cathedrals and the experience as, you know, professor and as an academic to go visit these places that, you know, she studied. And she said something along the lines of like, you know, when you go to this place of worship, it's important to kind of see how it's been modernized, right? So whether it's open to the public, whether it's still a place of worship, whether it's turned into a museum, and that kind of changes your experience of it. So kind of like the Hagia Sophia, if it changes back into something else, that will change how you can relate to the building and to that space.
Yes, exactly. And going off of that, also the denomination sometimes just has a certain effect. So I grew up Episcopalian, was baptized Episcopalian. My grandfather was an Episcopalian priest, but I no longer identify necessarily as religious. Yeah. I would say I have a spiritual inclination, but it's not labeled to a particular sect of religion. However, I absolutely adore going to churches and cathedrals and visiting. But I do have an awareness of the type of church I'm walking into.
Yeah.
Just for me, it feels as a form of respect and also just awareness. The architecture will be affected a certain way, what's shown in statues or stained glass windows, but also whether or not I need to be prepared. So like when I was in Italy, you have to have, when I was in Florence, you have to cover your shoulders and or your head as a sign of respect when you enter the church. So even though it was blazing hot, when I was walking around Florence, I would wear a scarf in my hair as a bow so that when I walked into churches, I could take it off and like drape myself. But I saw so many tourists, unfortunately, a lot of them were American, being turned away because they weren't in appropriate clothing.
Yeah, I remember also like shorts weren't allowed. I remember one time I had to wear like a scarf on, like as a skirt, and I remember thinking, oh, this is a bit too. Because I don't know if it's been the same for you, but I've always gone in the summer, and it's always been too hot, and like the last thing I want to do is go into a church.
Yeah. So when I was visiting in Paris, France, as well as Italy, the churches that I was visiting, it was summer, it was hot, it was warm, but I didn't have, this is when I was backpacking Europe, and I didn't have shorts. I just had skirts.
Oh, that's smart.
But skirts still had to be a certain length. I think it was something like
knee,
a couple inches up to the knee or slightly above. So I was lucky because I was always quote unquote getting away with it because I was wearing flowing clothes.
Right.
But yes, I saw many many tourists being turned away because they were in shorts or they were in inappropriate shoes or their shirts it wasn't deemed respectful and appropriate for that space.
Yeah.
And so I think that this conversion back into a mosque has certain implications just in regard to like also feeling sense of comfort. Like I don't know, like when I go into extremely Roman Catholic churches, even though I'm not Catholic, I feel like when I go to a certain altar to admire the space, slightly uncomfortable because I don't want to seem disrespectful. Maybe that's my own.
No, I get that.
Feel.
I also feel like when you go into cathedral, especially if it's a place of worship, I often sit there and I think I don't want to take up the space that's, you know, for the people who want to come here and pray and do whatever they want to do in the church or in the cathedral. And so I kind of roam around really quickly, don't really speak to anyone, and then leave.
Yeah. I vividly remember, so when I went to Notre Dame the first time, this was in summer of 2017, you know, I queued in line to get in.
Yeah.
And when I went in, I mean, absolutely stunning. I almost started crying the moment I walked in, just how powerful it is, and also encountering such a famous, iconic building. And also the Hunchback of Notre Dame from Disney was one of my absolute favorites
God,
as a child.
same.
So I also had this like kind of emotional reaction to that. But I felt slightly kind of disappointed by how quote unquote touristy it was, and how many people there were, because I really wanted to absorb it. And people were just like taking all these selfies and walking around and not necessarily interacting with the history.
Yeah.
And it just felt weird to me, like kind of, it's hard to describe. But then I went across the street to St. Severin Church, which is this beautiful, I think it's a 12th century church, and it's famous for one of its main columns being a twisted column, and the way that the arches all like weave into this column and spin. And it was completely empty and dark, even though it was built around the same time. And,
no, I agree. Okay.
And we have gotten lost in our conversation, but we are
Yeah.
going to play our clip as we segue into laughing at or laughing with the Middle Ages.
Serving flagons of mead. Now, her costume was obviously Germanic, but in 1487, the Bavarian purity laws, or Reinheitsgebot, severely limited the availability of mead. At best, they would have had some sort of spiced wine.
You're nitpicking.
Oh, really? Well, here's another nit for you. The flagons would not have been made of polypropylene.
Renaissance fairs aren't about historical accuracy. They're about taking chubby girls who work at Kinko's and lacing them up in corsets so tight their bosom jumps out and says, howdy.
Bosoms would not have said howdy in the 15th century. If anything, they would have said huzzah.
I don't care what the bosoms say, Sheldon. I just want to be part of the conversation.
Hi, guys. Looks like you've been to the Renaissance fair, I'm hoping.
Renaissance fair, more of a medieval / Age of Enlightenment / any excuse to wear a codpiece fair.
So that was a clip from the television series Big Bang Theory, for if any of you were listening and thinking, those voices sound very familiar, can't place it. So Big Bang Theory, hometown, Pasadena, California. Whenever I introduce myself to people, and, you know, they go, where are you from? That's a question. I'll go, have you seen the Big Bang Theory?
Oh, that's a smart way of doing it.
Yeah, because people don't really know about the Rose Parade. But they work at Caltech, which I currently live a 15-minute walk from. So
cool.
But that aside, we want to kind of break apart so Sheldon is the one that is the very kind of straight, very literal person.
Yeah.
And talking about how inaccurate, how anachronistic the Renaissance fair was.
And he's and for like to improve, like enhance the comedic effect, he's wearing a nun costume. And given that he's tall and lanky, that makes it funnier as well.
Right. So we were brought to attention to this clip through an article by Louise Dassin that talks about comedy in the Middle Ages. And she just talks briefly about this scene and also the way that the characters are dressed. So since this is an audio format, Sheldon is dressed as a monk with a cowl and a giant wooden cross across his chest. And then Leonard, who is his closest friend, confidant, is dressed as a knight. He has a faux chainmail. And then we have Raj, who's dressed as what looks like a squire and definitely looks a bit more Renaissance rather than
Yeah, I agree.
medieval, with a big plume in his hat. So that's quite interesting. And then the last character, Howard, is dressed as a court jester, and that's what the hat was talking about, in the bright colors and the bells on the sides of the hat. But we want to return. So each character, in a nutshell, is dressed sort of like their personality, one could argue.
Yeah.
So Howard is like the funny one that's kind of making the slightly
Inappropriate
sexist,
jokes.
insensitive jokes about women. We have Raj, who's quite quiet and just off to the side. We have Leonard, who becomes kind of the defender of the anachronism.
Yeah.
We don't have it in this clip, but he tells Sheldon to like calm down. It's not that big of a deal. So he's like the knight for anachronism.
Yeah.
And then we have Sheldon, the like quote unquote dry,
rigorous,
austere figure in the monk's outfit.
And I think also this kind of clip emphasizes one of the difficulties as viewers that we have with like comedy or representations of the Middle Ages and the medieval in certain ways, and like why we laugh at a medieval setting scene rather than why we don't. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're laughing at our own ignorance, because a lot of the time we don't really know. We imagine that it's set in the Middle Ages, but it's actually not.
Right. And there's a great quote by Terry Jones, who is part of Monty Python, which we will get into Monty Python and the Holy Grail as our kind of case example for what we're talking about. But so Terry Jones becomes an amateur / professional medievalist throughout his life and writes a lot of books about Chaucer. But he says in this article that he wrote, the medieval world wasn't a time of stagnation or ignorance. A lot of what we assume to be medieval ignorance is, in fact, our own ignorance about the medieval world. So exactly that, like what we're laughing at, we don't necessarily know what it is we're laughing at. And that's quite compelling, especially for our conversation today.
Yeah, which is why we chose this.
Yes, definitely. And we want to make a quick clarification before we delve in a bit further. The difference between medieval studies and medievalism, because we will be talking about those words interchangeably, not interchangeably, but frequently. So medievalism, if you can kind of tell by the ism at the end, is the study of responses to the Middle Ages at all periods since the sense of the medieval began to develop. So medievalism is usually distinguished from its long-established parent, medieval studies, which involves study of the actual Middle Ages, the period's literatures, languages, history, architecture, wars, religion, and people. So the primary sources that we then take medievalism from, case examples would be A Knight's Tale, Princess Bride, Game of Thrones as medievalism.
Yeah.
So some context for us as we move forward. So we toe the line between both. We look at medievalism and what it takes from medieval studies.
Yes. And in a way, this is exactly the structure that we had in our course. So we would go back to the sources and then look at the ways in which it was transformed in the present or in, more modern times. And we kind of saw that progression through our class.
Exactly. And one could argue, as we said in our very first introductory episode, that we are still kind of in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And part of this ignorance that we should kind of talk about that links us to last week was they keep talking about the Renaissance fair being in the 15th century. So this means the 1400s.
Yeah.
And Sheldon, of course, is like, well, this is all over the place. This is Enlightenment. This is Renaissance. This is medieval. So this is like 500, 600 years. Yeah. But last week, if you recall, we were talking about the Black Plague, which was in the 1450s, which is the 15th century.
Yeah.
The Renaissance did, in fact, start in Italy in the 15th century. Sometimes
Florence.
historians argue that it's in response to the Black Death, but it is quite curious, this idea of the medieval that we have, where, at least for me, growing up and thinking about, when I think about the Black Death, the Black Plague, I think exclusively that it's a medieval phenomena, that it was
I agree.
in the quote unquote dark ages. It's negative, all of that. But at the same time, if the Renaissance is starting and it's this good kind of rebirth, beautiful, artistic time, there's a split almost between good and evil, between light and dark occurring.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I feel like in the way that it's taught very frequently kind of shows the Middle Ages as a period of stagnation, of no progress, I know progress is not a word that we should really use with history, but like with no scientific improvements or inventions, and like this period where nothing actually came to be and nothing new happened, when actually in reality that's not really the case. And if we just look at the dates of beginning of the Renaissance and certain movements that started happening in Italy, and when they were transferred to France, like that linear timeline doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. Time isn't separated into these really neat little boxes. It's very messy. Things overlap.
Yeah.
And it can get very overwhelming. Like, I do not, we're not saying that, oh, well, this is a simple, crossover. It's very messy, which is exciting, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, so as we delve in more into our idea of laughing at this, I want to kind of set us up a little bit on what you were just saying, Elo, and this is kind of continuing the conversation about the medieval as being destructive or as being non, quote unquote, progressive. Yeah. So we're going to return to good old Umberto Eco, and this is from his book, Faith and Fakes, which we discussed in the very, very first introductory episode that we had. And he is discussing how we are still living in the Middle Ages. So this is the name of the chapter that he discusses this. He's talking about how college campuses in America, so this is primarily Ivy League or like University of Chicago, are kind of these neo-medieval monasteries in the way that they're set up, and these places of worship, but of knowledge or academia, and how we record history and everything. And then he goes back to the way that the Middle Ages were produced and how that production relates to what we call the Renaissance. And he says that the Middle Ages didn't necessarily carry out a systematic preservation, a form of recording history. He says, rather, it performed a heedless destruction and a disordered preservation. It lost essential manuscripts and saved others that were quite negligible. It scratched away marvelous poems to write riddles or prayers in their place. It falsified sacred texts, interpolating other passages, and in doing so, wrote its own books, quote unquote. The Middle Ages preserved in its way the heritage of the past, but not through hibernation, rather through a constant retranslation and reuse. It was an immense work of bricolage, balanced among nostalgia, hope, and despair.
So what's really interesting is if you might know of Umberto Eco through the film and book, The Name of the Rose. And just hearing this again, it reminds me of, the kind of portrayal of The Name of the Rose and how the monks were represented, and the idea of studying, and, the idea that there's no critical thinking that takes place in most of the great academics of the time. But again, that's not really, this may have been true for certain fields, but it's not true in all respects, and in all, by all means, is not the definition of the Middle Ages in a way. Right.
And The Name of the Rose, which features good old Sean Connery and and a very, very young Christian Slater, is a really, really interesting and compelling example to think about this, because it has that kind of austere format to it. And spoiler alert, but the ending is all about one of the oldest monks trying to repress a Greek text. I believe it's by Plato.
Aristotle is the text on laughter, which actually has never been found. So that wasn't
Right.
taking a piece of history and putting it in an anachronistic way.
Right. But exactly, this monk wants to repress this text, and he does it through murder, but because he thinks that laughter doesn't have a place in the monastery, that laughter is a corruption, that laughter is something that is unsacred or unholy. And there's like an irony to that, because at least today, when we look at the medieval, so much of it is directly related to comedy, to laughing at and or with the Middle Ages.
And
so yeah.
I think one thing that we should mention as well is the ideas of laughing at and laughing with. And so obviously we've talked about it very briefly, but in a way it kind of relates to the way laughing at something kind of doesn't takes away the idea that you're thinking about it with the culture in mind or with the period in mind. Whereas if you're laughing with the knowledge of what the culture was like. And so in a way it's like an inside joke in certain ways, very simplistically put. And in a way, if you think about, when we think of the, medieval laughing at like the scenery in the medieval times and all that, I wouldn't say it's very smart. We don't laugh at like very smart things. We laugh at like
fart jokes.
People being a bit silly, or like very simple humor, whereas actually in reality it was quite witty.
There's a very kind of scatological sense of the medieval,
for sure.
And or on the flip side, the barbaric. There's also a lot of fun poked at the very austere religious side of the medieval, which I guess is quite an easy target. But then again, it's not. That is laughing at more than with. I feel it's more laughing at the idea of religion rather than the medieval itself. But because the medieval is so entwined and associated with the religious, that people conflate the two. So that's why we really want to take this argument into Monty Python's The Holy Grail, because we think that it's an excellent example of both, and it's a cult classic. And even if you haven't seen the film, we feel that you have inevitably either heard of it or seen clips.
Especially if you're British.
So Ella, do you recall like your first encounter with Monty Python and the Holy Grail?
So I think my first encounter was quite a late one. It was one of our listeners, I hope, Liv, my boyfriend's sister. I think she must have showed me a couple of clips, and it kind of stuck with me. And then I watched it for the first time, most of it yesterday. So my encounter is quite new, but it kind of didn't feel that new, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Which I guess speaks to its presence in kind of everyday culture.
What about you?
So I have been trying to think of kind of exactly when I encountered Monty Python. I was a preteen, I know that. Let's say I was 12. So this is after I studied the Arthurian cycle and legends in school. And I think it was directly related to the birth of YouTube. So around like 2007, and the clip of the French Guard. I feel like that was something that was kind of circulating around my group of friends for some reason. And so I watched the movie, and I remember I just didn't understand 90% of it and found it boring and really long, even though it's only an hour and a half. And, as I've grown through time, because that was quite a while, over a decade ago, scenes come up here and there. The Black Knight is perhaps the most famous, at least
Yeah.
in my mind. He's like, "'Tis but a scratch."
And actually, interestingly, I found that was like, if anyone's read Italo Calvino's books, some of them reminded me of like some of the absurd settings of his plots, and it was very strange to see how like that kind of thing is perpetuated in our culture. That view of the Middle Ages, kind of timeless and kind of ahistorical and anachronistic.
Yeah, and that's like that's such an interesting connection, because I haven't read any Italia Calvino, but also because in researching in preparation for this podcast today, that scene is one of the ones that is actually kind of directly related to the Middle Ages. It's a conflation of romantic poems where knights go off into their quest and experience like great physical harm and say things like "'tis but a scratch" or "I'm fine and I continue." They weren't necessarily like completely disembodied, but that's like a recurring trope throughout the medieval storytelling. So the Monty Pythons, the Pythons, anyways, they were, as we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, like, for example, Terry Jones, were medievalists. They were actually quite aware of what they were doing, and then like poking fun at that and taking that and manipulating it into their sense of comedy.
Kind of, making it absurd when actually it is representative of the time.
Exactly. And another fantastic example of this is the Rabbit of Kerbenog. So the famous rabbit scene, which watching that, I rewatched Monty Python last night and significantly enjoyed it and laughed much harder than preteen self. So that scene, it seems so absurd that they're like terrified of this rabbit that is just destroying them. It's like a Bunnicula, but on steroids. But so that scene is actually taken from medieval texts, most specifically from statues and illustrations around Notre Dame in Paris.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So there are scenes of this, or depictions of the sin of cowardice, and there are knights running from rabbits. So something that is seemingly harmless, causing cowardice. So again, they're taking, and this is also shown in marginalia throughout medieval manuscripts. So those little side doodles that we all kind of associate with the medieval, I would think, they're really trending on Twitter and memes. Like they're
they're the thing right now,
which I'm all for. Give them to me. Give me more. But so that scene, which again just seems but bonkers. Like what drug were they on to think of this? One may think it's actually very cleverly and intuitively linked to something that is medieval.
It's true.
And I mean, the medieval has some fucking wild marginalia and themes. Lots of snails, knights fighting snails, people being swallowed by random fish, knives going into heads, but the person seems fine. Like, that's a whole other thing of why, and they're not always sure. But this is a great example of laughing with the Middle Ages.
Yeah. And then there's another scene which I thought was like it was funny, but then also it was a bit like laughing at rather than with. Do you remember the scene where they're in front of the French castle and there's a Trojan horse?
The Trojan rabbit, yeah.
And they forget to get inside it. Which felt more like laughing at than laughing with.
Yeah, that's kind of laughing at the ignorance, I guess.
Yeah.
And there's also the continuing theme, I guess, of like the stupidity where Arthur can't count. And so this is back in the Rabbit of Kerbenog scene, because it's just such a rich medieval scene where he's getting ready to throw the holy hand grenade of Antioch, which actually looks very eerily like the sovereign's orb of the United Kingdom. Like they look the same, so that's like a satire political joke. But when he's getting ready to throw it, after he pulls the pin out, he goes 1, 2, 5, and one of the other knights has to correct him because he just can't count or do math at all throughout the entire movie.
Oh, I feel that.
So, I mean, yeah, maths are not my strong suit, but just very, very funny. And then there are other scenes that are both laughing at and laughing with. So I'm also thinking of the scene, the witch scene.
Yeah.
So there were witches in the Middle Ages, but not the way that we necessarily
think of them. Yeah.
Actually, that's a much more modern idea. I mean, witch hunts with like believe it's James the First or James the Fourth in Scotland, and he wrote the Demonology in the early 17th century, and that was like when the witch trials occurred.
Right.
And that's also like contemporary to the Salem witch trials. So that's separated by a couple hundred years.
But it's interesting. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that scene, it's quite early on, just floored me. I was laughing so hard. Maybe no one else thinks it as funny as I am. But when they're talking about why would a witch float? Oh, it's because she's made of wood. And there's the one, the judge, the executioner, priest, whatnot. He goes, well, how can we tell if she's made of wood? And one of the audience members goes, we make a bridge from her. And I don't know, I can't deliver it in a way that's funny, but that just slayed me. I laughed, like, that's just because it's logical. Like, if something's made of wood, how do you test if it's made of wood? Well, you make something out of it, but that made me laugh. And then that leads into the notion of ducking. So Arthur comes and says, like, oh, it's like a duck that floats. But which, again, that's a modern association. Witches in the Middle Ages are oftentimes people who deal with like herbs and everything, like medicine makers. Or I learned this from listening to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the podcast, where they're talking about it. The iconography of witches is actually from alewives in the Middle Ages. And so they, as their name says, were women who made and sold beer. And they wore the giant pointed hats to be discernible from people, as a symbol.
Right.
But they became very wealthy and had a lot of power because they were in charge of alcohol. So politicians then demonized them and said that they were bad, and that's why witches now look the way that they look when we think of them.
But it's so interesting, right? Because like everything that seems like super surreal and just crazy and like out of anything that we could possibly imagine, we ascribe to the Middle Ages, when actually in reality most of it didn't really happen then, but it kind of is brought back to that.
Yeah, and it's kind of occurred throughout history, but if something is either undescribable or something that is non-desirable, it is pushed back to the medieval as, again, that erroneously considered time of just chaos and darkness.
Yeah. And so I think as well, like one thing we'd like to mention is obviously, like, there is this term called medieval films, and like obviously that is super anachronistic because the technology wasn't there at the time, but like that idea, which is in itself like not placed in time, allows for other anachronistic portrayals of things. And that is also why we love to watch medieval films most of the time, because there's relatable but not relatable, and the things that aren't relatable actually often aren't ascribed to that period.
Yeah, I mean, a great example kind of that, or a twist of that, is A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, where it does this kind of, I just always think of like Baz Luhrmann and Moulin Rouge, where it takes contemporary songs or pop culture songs and puts it in the film. So obviously an audience at a jousting fest chanting "We Will Rock You" by Queen, you know, and like stomping on the
Oh my
the stage.
God.
Like they might have had chants. I don't know. I don't know much
don't
about
know either.
jousting, but not, you know, Queen. Something that I found really interesting regarding the research on this was, so in Monty Python, they originally had a deal with the Scottish historic, like National Trust, to film in certain castles.
Right.
And then 2 weeks before primary filming was going to commence, the Scottish National Trust pulled out because they thought that the troupe was going to cause damage not only physically to the buildings, but also historic damage, which I find very, very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It's
Just
quite like, it's the idea that there's a certain type of history that can be known by the masses, and like anything that, the idea that if you laugh at something, you're actually denigrating the content.
right, and that the perhaps it was like the association potentially that these castles would then have to, you know, this comedy film. But then again, as we've said, they were very in tune and aware. And Dune Castle, which is the primary castle with the external facade, and so like the Frenchman looking down, is arguably one of the most well-preserved castles in Scotland. And they were able to film there because it was privately owned.
Right.
And it's quite compelling because, you know, you think somewhere maybe like Edinburgh Castle and thinking that that is super medieval, but it's actually been added on to throughout the centuries and is still kind of going through that, and is arguably actually less historically adequate for those purposes than somewhere like Dune. Or the castle at the end is called, I love its name, Stalker Castle, the one that's in the middle of the lake. And that was also privately owned. So that's why they were able to film there. So I just find that, that like damage to history, what does that mean? I mean, I understand what it means, but like, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, and it's, you know, I kind of think as well, like that kind of shows the power of comedy, because it scares people to think that you could use history and add a comedic twist to it, and that could somehow change the way that you perceive a period of time, when obviously it's a sketch. So how accurate can it be?
Yeah, and that just makes me think of contemporary parody, satire, and comedy. So, for example, Saturday Night Live in America and the comedy around politics that's going on, and how that actually has significant political and social sway. But I feel that something like a Monty Python of being filmed at these castles is a very different type of influence of history and comedy.
Agreed.
And yeah, like, how does comedy perpetuate and continue to live and thrive throughout time? Which, I mean, it's hard to know. It's hard to say.
So these were some of the things that, you know, we've been thinking about. But obviously these are like a modern interpretation of, this is more of a medievalist interpretation of a medieval setting and, you know, kind of a story. But if you think about adaptations of medieval comedic texts, such as, I know I keep going on about it, but it's one of the few things I know about, the Decameron, which is considered often portrayed and represented because of like its, you know, very vulgar humor, when in reality the language itself is very, very, very fine and very witty and very smart. And there was a criticism that was made of Pasolini's adaptation of the Decameron. So he used Neapolitan dialect instead of the Tuscan dialect, which was the one that the Boccaccio used. And one of the criticisms was that actually, like, because obviously the film format meant that he had to, the kind of visual took over and the linguistic was kind of secondary, and that took away from the finesse of the language and like only showed a certain one aspect or one side of Boccaccio's text and story. And so within that, it's interesting because as well, like the idea of how accurate, how close to the text, how close to the history you are gives a certain vision of the Middle Ages or the medieval text, and kind of it reinforces one perspective rather than another. And I guess this is what we're trying to show you guys and giving you a couple of examples to think with of what like comedy can do and what it should do and what it means for the text or what it means for the scenery or what it means for the period. So yeah,
and I guess just like a final thought in relation to that for us is thinking about why, for example, the medieval is almost primarily films that are comedies. Like why is comedy the filter through which we return to the medieval, whereas something not much later, let's go with the modern times or the modern era of Henry VIII, so late 16th century, and Queen Elizabeth, those are associated with dramas and historic films, period pieces and costumes. And those can be quite dry and quite long, also very painful. But we don't necessarily see that with the medieval. And I guess just kind of reflecting on why that is. And we're hoping that this kind of comedy conversation touches upon that, and we don't necessarily know the answers.
No, we don't.
But it is just something worth thinking about.
Yeah.
And how we interact with the medieval in our everyday lives.
That's it for now. But if you want to listen to other episodes and if you've missed them, please follow us on SoundCloud, on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, or on Podbean.
Yes, and if you follow us on any of those platforms, please give us a thumbs up, a heart, or a positive review. And if you have any qualms or questions, you can send us a good old-fashioned email at modern.medieval.podcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on social media. We have a public Facebook page under the podcast name. We have an Instagram where we have really fun stories. You can find us there at podcast.modern.medieval. And finally, you can find us on Twitter where we have current updates about what's going on in the podcast. So until next time, do, 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 do.